And it's always a great honour to be here in PRONI, and my links with PRONI go beyond just giving a talk, because my Milltown archive and my City Cemetery archive are now part of the PRONI collections. That vast amount of documentation held about us and given so much detail in the history of this place we call home. I have evolved, when I am now researching the cemetery, the very first thing I do is particularly a smaller cemetery, I photograph every headstone, I photograph every feature, I walk the cemetery, I study headstones, and what it's about for me is creating a map in my head. So even before I put pen to paper, I will have in my head a near complete map of the site that I am researching. And I also take photographs because the eye tells you lies. So when you look at a photograph, for instance, I've often said, if I write down the name Irvin, I'll maybe write down Irwin, because it's the eye assuming. And so taking a photograph is really essential for me. But what it's about is getting a map in my head. So it is no coincidence that I start the day with a map. And this is a map of the Falls Road in 1857. And I suppose a study of cemeteries has brought me into the area of studying maps, because there's so much information. But let me just try and explain this map. This is the Lisburn Road. Here you have the railway. This is the Bog Meadows. Here is the junction, which we remember fondly as the underpass that flooded a few years ago. This, and it's the language of yesterday, is the Lunatic Asylum. And I do have to say, this is where my grandparents met, but might I add, not as inmates. So, and this is the Falls Road, of course. We would know this today as the Grosvenor Road. You'll notice there's no Springfield Road. This would be St Dominic's Grammar School today. So you're coming up Clowney Bridge here at Beachmount Avenue. This is the Irish Language School today. Blackstock Way, one of the oldest of lanes in Belfast. And today this is known as McCrory Park. And here you have the site of the Belfast City Cemetery. If you look at an earlier 1830s map, you will see there's no Glen Road, there's no Springfield Road. So this is a map in 1857, and it is this site that becomes the Belfast City Cemetery. And of course, over here you have the site of what was to become Milltown Cemetery, and the story of Milltown and the city are interlinked. So two big pressures really act on Belfast corporations who start looking for a burial ground in the middle of the 19th century. First is the famine, and the burial grounds of Belfast are filling up because of the famine dead, and also the population of Belfast is expanding. There is another factor that starts to kick in, and that is that Belfast Corporation becomes the legal formal burial board of the town of Belfast. That means if you live in the town of Belfast, they have a responsibility of creating the burial services for the town. So in 1866, they buy over 100 acres of land off the Engler family of Turf Lodge, and they do that in June of 1866. But to do that, they need what is called a local parliamentary act, because the ground they are burying is outside the town boundary. So this is what is called a local parliamentary act to allow Belfast Corporation to buy the land. And that 100 acres of land they use for a burial ground, but they also keep a substantial section of it for a park. And we know that park today as the Falls Park. So the cemetery, they bring in a man called Gay, and he really is a part of that movement in the 19th century of designers, architects, landscape designers. And this process starts with Père Lachaise in Paris in 1803, where that cemetery is laid out and designed in terms of drainage, what sort of paths, what shrubs are used, what trees will be planted, and you can see this movement right through in municipal burial grounds right through the 19th century. So Gay then designs a cemetery, and he designs a cemetery in the shape of a bell. And if you notice, this is the bell here, probably taken from the bell in Belfast. And it was meant to be interdenominational, so therefore the Catholics of Belfast were given 15 acres and a site for a mortuary chapel, and class and creed were built into the design. So when it was being designed, this main entrance, which is the main entrance today, was for the Protestants of Belfast. This entrance was for the Catholics of Belfast. Over here you have prayer ground at the back of the original cemetery, and it had its own entrance there on the White Rock Road, out of sight and out of mind, so to speak. And when the Jewish community got a piece of land or prayer ground, they had their own entrance on the White Rock Road. And then the graves, when they had 6 classes of grave. In 1869, when this cemetery opened, a class 1 grave would have cost you £7 10 shillings, and you would have found that on the path, so a roadside grave, and then it went down to class 6, a £1 for those in straitened circumstances, somebody like myself. So the less you paid, the more you went into the section of into the middle of the section, and then they had class 6 graves surrounded on the perimeter of the prayer ground. And you can see here, this was the site of a mortuary chapel. This was meant to be the site of the mortuary chapel for the Catholics, which never happened, because what happened was that the Bishop of Down and Connor decided he would have a dispute with the corporation, and the dispute was about this: who had the ultimate burial rights for the Catholics to be buried in the cemetery. And they were meant to be buried over in this section here. And what was at stake was Catholic canon law. So a stillborn child would not be buried in Catholic blessed ground, nor would someone who had taken their own life, nor would someone who had been excommunicated. And the last category, I was doing a tour one day in the cemetery, and I said a Catholic who bought a grave as a Catholic and then became a Protestant, and at that point a voice at the back went, God forbid, would not be buried in Catholic blessed ground. So what then happened was, eventually they came to a compromise. The bishop got £4,000, and he bought 15 acres of land across the Falls Road, which we know as the top end of Milltown Cemetery. And the corporation was relieved of its responsibility for the burying of the Catholics of the city. But in the preparation for and the design of the cemetery, they had decided that the way they would separate out Catholic blessed ground from the rest was they would build a wall. And what they built is a wall along this section, but it was an underground wall. So this is the top of it, and it runs to the depth of a grave and the length of the whole section, and it's still there to this day. It is 6 inches, as you can see, just below the surface. When you see it, you think it's a path, but in fact what you're looking at is the line of an underground wall, and it is very substantial. It's not just red bricks, a few red bricks separating out, but it's the black stone of the perimeter wall that was used, and that's only a very small top section of the wall, and it's tapered. It really is a very substantial wall, and it is there to this day. Now the cemetery opened on the 1st of August 1869, and 4 days later Annie Collins was buried in the prayer ground, and she's 3 years and 3 months now. From that day to this, about 250,000 people have been buried in the city cemetery. So this is a minute of the Cemetery Committee on the 5th of October 1869. And you can see here Daniel Jaffa, and the council, or the corporation, received a letter asking for a piece of ground for the burial of the Jews of Belfast. It's a small community then, and it is then the very first burial. They're given a piece of land at the poor ground, and they have one stipulation from the corporation. They have to build a wall. But this time, it's a wall above ground. And what I think is taking place is a very subtle form of anti-Semitism, in that this burial ground was a Christian burial ground. So they didn't want to see the Jews on their burial space. And the very first Jewish were buried this end of the cemetery, and they're German Jews. And they're here as business people. Then you can see in the 1880s, as there is persecution of the Jews by the Tsar, you start to see them arriving in Belfast. And then, so there's a big lump of poor ground here, and then you see later on they begin to settle, they're in business, and they're able to afford headstones. And this end of the Jewish burial ground it is where you get the bulk of the headstones to this day. This is what is called a small, we would know it as a chapel, but in the Jewish it's a tahara. And in the Jewish tradition, you were buried after one day, and they mourned you after 1 year. And it appears that they would only bury one person to a grave. But I came across a grave of a woman and a newborn baby in the same grave. And for me, this is particularly poignant, because in the Jewish tradition, it is the woman who carries the religion forward. So in this grave, both the past and the present have died. The woman is the past, carrying on the great traditions, and the child is the future. And I think it particularly poignant to this day, because the Jewish community in Belfast is very small, and it has long since passed its critical mass of regeneration. So this site is a very important historical site to tell you about the endeavours and the life of this community. And this is a blocked up gate on the White Rock Road, and on the lintel above it you can see in Hebrew that it is the word Bethlehem, and it is the gateway of the living. And it is still there to this day to remind us of the Jewish community that were buried, members of the Jewish community that were buried in that small cemetery. And the last burial took place in 1964 of a man called Abraham Herbert. And he was buried in June of 1964. And today, the members of the Jewish community will be buried, I think, in Carmoney. This is the superintendent's house, and opened in 1873. It's still used to this day as an office. It's a beautiful building. It was designed by Lanyon. This is a mortuary chapel, and it was also built in 1873. Now, in the early 1970s, the cemetery suffered very severe vandalism, and this small chapel was burned. And I think today that the council took the easy option, because instead of just blocking it up and keeping it till such times that they would reopen it, they actually tumbled the small church, and the only thing that's left is its tower. Also in this, it always pains me that this vandalism came from my own community. It was terrible what happened to the cemetery in the 70s. So a lot of stuff was stolen. You see the brass plaques? These would have told you of a section, the section references. This corner, these are obelisks. This is called Masonic corner, because these are all Masonic graves here in the cemetery. This is the fountain, as it was in the 1870s, and you can see one of the things you get a sense of from this photograph of what this cemetery must have looked like, say, in the early part of the 20th century, because the stones would be still pristine. You wouldn't get the environmental damage. You don't have the growth of trees, because particularly in this last 40 years, there's been an enormous amount of natural seeding. So trees are grown, on graves. And when you stand and you look from this section, you can see you're looking down into Belfast. On a good day, you could have seen the Mull of Galloway. You could see Slieve Gullion in South Armagh. You looked across the Malone Heights, and it must have been really some sight. When you look, you get a sense of it here, of the pristine nature of the headstones. So this is what it looked like in 1901. You can see the development along the railway line in Lisburn Road. This, of course, is what we today call, this is an industrial estate, but was then the Bog Meadows. And you can see this is the cemetery here. When it opened on the 1st of August 1869, it was called the Belfast Cemetery, and you can see it here. And also you can see the top end of Milltown Cemetery, and of course the Falls Park. And in the Falls Park there was an old mill dam, and as a youth it was, I remember swimming there, and we called that the cooler. It was owned by the corporation, but you can see again the area is really starting to develop. Now in 1911 they extend the cemetery westwards towards the mountain by buying, this section is called Glenalina, and you can see the different flax. These were mills for the production and the laying out of the flax. And at this point, when they buy Glenalina, and they rename the cemetery the Belfast City Cemetery, and the first burials took place here in 1915. This is what it looks like today. As I said, Falls Road. The main entrance today, this is the Jewish burial ground. This is poor ground. This section here, this small section, is a hidden section within the poor ground, and it belongs to Queen's University. And buried in there are the remains of those that were used for medical research at Queen's, and particularly in the period of 1918 and 1919, in the period of Spanish Lady Flu. This is poor ground, this is a bit of poor ground, and there's another section up here of poor ground, and there are 80,000 poor, so that's about a third of all those buried in this cemetery were buried in the poor ground, which gives you something of the nature of poverty in Belfast at the time. So this is the cemetery as it is today. This is an aerial photograph taken in 1967. You can see the Falls Road here. This is McCrory Park. This was the first ground of the football team, Belfast Celtic. It was then sold to the GAA, and Belfast Celtic moved to the ground on the Donegal Road. Here, and you can see it in the 1830s map, here is a footprint of an Irish round fort. And in the very first Ordnance Survey, it is so clear. And what you begin to see in the Ordnance Survey maps, really right up until the 1960s, that this is a very ancient landscape. So here's Ballymurphy, this is the cooler I was talking about, this is the Falls Park, and this is Turf Lodge that's just being built at the time. And here you can really see the Vale of Belfast. So this is, for me, these are very beautiful photographs that tell us so much. Now, our first, this is a man called James Craig, and his wife are buried here. And this is the father of James Craig, the first Prime Minister in the old Stormont government. Now, where he is buried is what is called a select position. So you have to have a few shillings to be buried there. And when I went looking for him, I found it a bit difficult to get a lot of detail about him. Now, where he is buried, normally they're the Great Magoo of Belfast, so you can find them. And they're not difficult to find. But with James Craig, I found it was difficult to get a lot of information on him. And what I think is happening, he was a director of Dunville's, and Dunville's made whiskey. Now, if you know anything about the history of Belfast in the 19th century, you will know it is a temperance city. The temperance movement was started by the Reverend Engler of Oxford Street, and it was a very strong movement in this city. And I suspect his family didn't really want to talk about how he made his money. In other words, he made it making the old devil's brew. And they kept quiet about, you know, his wealth, because he was a very wealthy man. Now, he's buried, him and his wife are buried there in the cemetery. This is Harlan of Harlan Wolff. One of the things you find when you study a history of Belfast is that the finances of this city, in my view, are controlled by a small number of families. And the other thing about it, a lot of them intermarry. And I think they marry to keep the money tight. They don't want it displaced. So it's life and death in the city cemetery. They're all, you find them in the same location. So this is Harlan of Harlan and Wolff. This is William James Perry. William James was born in Canada. His father died there, and his mother brought him back. They lived in Con Lake. William James went to Inst. And one of the things you find when you study a history of Belfast in the 19th century, Inst, the Academical Institute, is a powerhouse for the mercantile elite. It produces so much of the leadership of this. It's amazing to once you begin to see that unravel. And William James left Inst at 15 and joined Harlan Wolff as a gentleman apprentice. By the age of 27, he was the chairman of his board. And it was William James who did the deal with the White Star Line. Essentially, they were doubling the North Atlantic trade, because Harlan's built the ships in the White Star, then of course sailed them, and you know, the Titanic and the Olympic. And in my view, he is one of the individuals that makes Belfast the Silicon Valley of its day. A very dynamic man. But when he died, he all but bankrupted Harlan's, because he kept all his business in his head. And to unravel his business connection, as I said, nearly bankrupted Harlan's when he died. His wife was a woman called Margaret Carlyle. Her name was Margaret Montgomery Carlyle. Her brother was the manager of Harlan's, and the Carlyles were the school teachers, English school teachers in Inst. Now, her name Montgomery comes from her grandfather, the Reverend Montgomery of Dunmurry. And in the 1820s, there is a schism inside the Presbyterian Church around the doctrine of Arianism. Arianism is essentially was a dispute about the Trinity, and it raged for 10 years, from right through the 1820s in the Presbyterian Church. And on one side you had Henry Cook, big conservative figure. On the other side you had Montgomery, big intellectual figure. And eventually Montgomery and those who thought like Montgomery left, and they formed the Remonstrant Synod. And we would know them today as non-subscribers. But I think what was taking place was not just a theological dispute, but it was also a political dispute. Cook is a conservative. Montgomery, his brothers were out with the United Irishmen. So he comes from that radical tradition inside Presbyterianism in the north. But Margaret Carlyle was a fantastic woman. When the Royal Victoria Hospital opened, she raised from her friends £100,000 for the equipping of a ward in the Royal Victoria Hospital. I heard a great story about William James. He was going through Harlan's one day, and he came across a worker and the sole of this man's boot was flopping. And Harry took a big wad of notes out, wrapped in an elastic band, took the notes out of the elastic band, and handed the elastic band to the man and said, "Here, wrap that around your boot." but apart from that, he is very powerful. You'll see this outside, you know, the Titanic Memorial in Belfast City Hall, because it was vandalised, and Harlan's had it, and in fact, with my research, so I rang them up and asked for it to be brought back, but they said no, and then I suggested that they put it back to the City Hall. So that's William James Perry. This is David Welch and Robert John Welch. David, photographer to the Lord Lieutenant, he comes from Scotland, lives in Strabane, is involved in photography. But it is his son, Robert John Welch, who I want to talk about. There is a very strong intellectual core in 19th century Belfast. And they often are the sons and the daughters of that mercantile elite. And you see them in the Literary Society, in the Philosophical Society, in the Lindhall Library, in the Botanic Gardens, in the Naturalist Field Club. And they really are people who engage with knowledge and the world they live in. And Robert John Welch is one of them. He's a photographer. And in the 1890s, he's of course ex-president of the Naturalist Field Club, but in the 1890s he's given a task by Harlan's of photographing all their ships as they are being built. And if you ever see the photographs of the Titanic and the Olympic and all the bringing the big screw into the shipyard, all taken by this man. But essentially he was a field botanist, and his photographs of cottages and flowers and rocks and mountains and cottages are beautiful, beautiful photographs. And while it has taken digital photographs years to perfect the idea that you go in and zoom in and still hold the detail, when you look at one of his photographs, what you begin to see is so much detail, even to a photograph 100 years ago, so much detail. And I think, in some sense, he's a part of that intellectual elite. You can see them in the arts, and in some ways, the only way we see them today is through our painters. If you think of Belfast and its painters, Lavery, Calvary, Connors, Dillon, Woods, you can see a whole. Belfast occupies a very special place in producing the painters of this island, and I think it is in a sense, it's a connection back to that intellectual core that was in the city. They are displaced as you go into the First World War and then partition, and I think, in a way, it's when you see them, they engage with knowledge and they engage with the world. This is Frank Workman, and along with his friend George Clark, he started the shipbuilding yard of Workman Clark on the north shore of the River Line. Now, when I went into the cemetery, when I was a kid going up the Falls Road, we'd always get to the gates of the city cemetery, and then we'd run like mad to the Falls Park. Why? Because we all knew the devil had appeared. Okay? What I think was happening, a very subtle form of sectarianism. The city cemetery was not our space. There were Protestants or Unionists or whatever, but we didn't see any ownership. We didn't feel any ownership to this cemetery. And so when I went in, this cemetery really opened my eyes, of course, to the history of the Belfast Protestant community and all its complexity, but it, in a sense, it started to upend my stereotypes. And one of the ways, these Irish stone crosses, there are better examples of them in the city cemetery than you have in Miltown. It's amazing to see it, and this isn't the best example. But they are beautiful stone crosses, and I think what I started to see was a complexity of identity in the city cemetery. And in some sense, I think we've narrowed the ground of who we are. Whereas in the city cemetery, you see unionists, and they're very strong unionists, and you see their sense of Irishness. So culturally they're Irish, politically they're unionist, and those two things are not in competition. And you see a lot of it here in this cemetery. So this is James Kelly, Kelly's coal boats. And those of us who are old enough will remember the quays on the Queen's Bridge. I think his grandfather was Samuel Kelly, started the business. He's buried in Balmoral. This is the Herdman stone. So this stone is designed, Herdmans of Herdman Channel, you know, of sandals, a big mercantile family. And this stone is called Egyptian Revivalist because it is designed as the door of an Egyptian temple. Now you can't see it very well, but up here you have a double-headed falcon. This is a disc with a cross. This is a Corinthian Column. Here you have inverted torches. And the torch upside down should not be lit because it doesn't have the oxygen. And here you have a cosmos flower. Now, when I looked at the cross, that started me thinking this is a Masonic stone, because I think that's a Templar cross. So after research, I believe this is the grave of a 33rd degree Prince Mason in the ancient and Scottish Rite. You can't see it so well here, but the double-headed falcon is the symbol of a Prince Mason. The Corinthian Column is a Masonic symbol of beauty. There are 5 sets of 4 rings, which I think are a representation of Jacob's ladder. The cosmos flower is the 8-pointed star of the octagon. This is called the Taurus, a surround. If you take one of these as a brick, and where they meet is one brick, there are 33 of them around this stone. So there are 2 levels of symbolism here in this monument. Egyptian Revivalist and then Masonic. In my view, after studying headstones in graveyards, I have come to the conclusion that human beings can't deal with the idea of death. So what we do, death is nothingness. And human beings are of the senses, so we smell, we hear, and in a sense that's how we experience the world we live in. And we can't imagine nothingness. So what we do is we conceptualize how we deal with death. So we talk about crossing the river. If you think about the book of life, you can't see it. You can't see its beginning and its end. Same with the scroll. A wreath, which is evergreen, has no beginning, no end. All of these are ways of us as human beings conceptualizing and trying to deal with death. And this is the power of symbolism that you find in the city cemetery. This is McLaughlin, Sea of Macedon. This is McLaughlin and Harvey. Macedon was where they lived on the shores of Belfast Law. A number of years ago there was a scandal there because it was a children's home and it's now tumbled. But look, their son George, killed in action at Lindley. George was a member of the 13th Battalion of the Imperial Yeomanry. So George, along with 550 of his comrades, rode into Lindley, and no one had bothered to tell him that a Boer general called the Vet had captured the town. There was an engagement, and 30 of the Imperial Yeomanry lost their lives in this engagement. James Craig, who I was talking about his father earlier on, James Craig, the very first Prime Minister, was captured by the Boers in this operation. A very dear friend of mine was killed in this action. John Powers, you know, the whiskey man from Dublin, he was killed in this action. Lord Longford was shot through the neck in this action. So this is, and of course, then they captured the remaining 520 Imperial Yeomanry. But look, George, the beloved wife, Emily, and she dies on the 27th of May 1900, and George dies on the 30th of May. He probably never got to know that his mother had died. This stone, and to show this, one of the, there are a few stones like this, and there's about 40 different flowers captured in this stone. Really, flowers, we tend to leave bunches of flowers, but you know, Victorians use flowers in terms of the symbolism on their headstones. This is Samuel Clean Davison, I think another Ennis boy. Went to, his father part owned a tea plantation in India, in Assam, and he went there. While he was there, he designed a machine for the production of the tea leaf, came back to Belfast and founded the Sirocco Works on the, is it East Bridge Road, is it? Over in East Belfast. So this is the founder of the Sirocco Works. And you see all the big names of industry are found in the city cemetery. This is John Martin. John was a builder. This is the man who built the City Hall in Belfast. Again, look at the cross. Over here, when I saw these columns first, I thought they were damaged. But this is called a broken column. And it's often used to tell us that of a young life cut short, or often it'll be used to tell us of a family that has died out. This is Albert James Lewis of Littlely, off the Belmont Road, and his wife Florence Augusta. Florence Augusta was one of the first women to get a degree in mathematics at Queen's College in Belfast. And Albert James was a solicitor in the police court. These are the parents of C.S. Lewis. I was doing a walk with a group from East Belfast, and they were telling me that there was a house opposite Littlely, and in the house they had a wardrobe that you could walk through. And Ian Allison once told me that when you went to the top of the Castlereagh Hills, you could see the Mourne Mountains, and so C.S. started to, in a sense, appropriate the images and the experiences of his youth, and they, of course, then became part of the Narnia story. This is, let me see, yes, John Kirk. Look what it says. His enduring monument is in the hearts and lives of the African converts. So John served for 30 years as a missionary in the Niger Delta. And I suppose, raised on the Falls Road, every Easter they used to collect for the black babies at the missions. But it's through the headstones that you find in the city cemetery that I begin to get a sense of the missionary effort, particularly of the Presbyterian Church. There's another stone, and it's got a bit of Arabic on it, God's love of a missionary who spent 30 years in Damascus. There's the Reverend McNeil. Reverend McNeil went to Manchuria in the 1890s with his wife. And during the First World War, the British Army and French Army brought thousands of Chinese over to do the hard work of digging trenches, all that hard, dirty work. And the Reverend McNeil came as their chaplain and returned with them after the First World War. But his story, he's buried in the city cemetery. But when the Japanese invaded Manchuria, he was arrested and was only released in 1942 as a part of a diplomatic deal. So you see this level of intensity around missionary work in the cemetery. This is Brother Andrews. He was a salesman in Coombe Barbers in North Hart Street. And this is very typically Masonic. You can see the symbolism of the compass, the square, of course the globe on the column. And you will see different variations of the compass in the square. Sometimes an arm of the compass would be onto the square. Sometimes you'll have flowers around the compass and square. And there's one stone where there are 7 flowers, and they're called crucifix. They've got 4 leaves. And I think it's a Knights Templar because an essential part of the symbolism of Knights Templar is the crucifix. So there's so much symbolism to be found in these in the cemetery. This is Mumby Mcmaster, and as you can see, he's got a Victoria Cross. Now, he was born in India, was serving and was buried in North Queen Street in Belfast and died. Now, his stone brings up a point that is, one of the things that I find quite rarely when I'm dealing with headstones is the mistakes of stonemasons. Because it's not like a blackboard that you can rub it out and start all over again. So Mumby. I had heard that his mother's name was Munby. Okay. But then there's another view that in fact, because he was born in India, that's his nickname, probably taken from Mumbai. And in the burial record, he's down as Murty, M-U-R-T-G-H, Mcmaster. He's one of 2 Victoria Crosses buried in the cemetery. That was gained during what is called here the Indian Mutiny, but the Indians call it their first war of national liberation. This is another soldier, Captain Francis Lovell Speed. He's a member of the Black Watch. This is, let me see, this is a Khedive Star, so that meant he was fighting the Mufti. This is the Egyptian medal and clasp. He's a member of the Black Watch, and you can see here, this is his belt and his sword. How he died, he was out riding his horse one day, and as he was going under the railway bridge at the bottom of the Upper Newtonards Road, as he was going under, a train was going over the bridge, and the horse bolted, and he was killed. And but there's this is some beautiful headstones. Now, this is James Green, and why I picked this stone out, look what it says about him. Submarined in 1914. Now, the way I interpret that stone is this man died early on in the First World War, and the term torpedoed hadn't come into. So submarine warfare, it's really in its infancy. So the term torpedoed hasn't come into common use, and so they just say submarine. So what this also tells us, headstones are of their time, and they give you a sense of a different world. This is William Bridget, Sergeant of the 17th Battalion Royal Irish Rifles. He's killed in action at scenes at a place called Swandrack in Holland. William was involved in one of the most successful military operations of the First World War. The British Army had tunnelled 22 shafts under the German lines, and then they filled those shafts full of 600 tons of high explosive. And at exactly 3:10 on the morning of the 7th of June, they detonated the mines. 19 of them were detonated, 2 failed to detonate, and 1 had been found by the Germans. Of the 2 that failed to detonate, 1 exploded on its own in the 1950s. Now, the strategy behind the operation was that the British Army would move exactly at 3:10 as the mines were detonated, so that they would come on the Germans in the confusion of the explosions. 10,000 Germans died in this operation, and what happened, we think, to William is that the mine he was moving towards failed to detonate for 17 seconds. Therefore, he was caught up in its blast. And there's 80 of these soldiers buried in a very small cemetery on the Sains Ridge. And this is one of the few operations where the 36th Ulster Division and the 16th Irish Division were deployed alongside one another. This is a wall which carries the names of soldiers who are buried throughout the cemetery who died during the First World War, soldiers and sailors. Because, of course, plots really don't come into being until after the First World War. This is called Roll of Honour Ground. It's in the Poor Ground. And they're named all on the wall. It has suffered very heavy vandalism in its time, because the drinkers find it a very convenient space, particularly during good weather. But likewise in Milltown Cemetery, there are about 40 service personnel buried in the Poor Ground, and this was probably the original Poor Ground. So they raised this in 1929 to remember all those who are buried in the cemetery. This is the Reverend McNeil I was telling you about, who was a missionary in Manchuria. People forget that the city cemetery is the biggest war cemetery in Ireland. There's about 400 headstones under the care of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and this is of Second World War dead. There are Norwegian sailors buried in the cemetery. There's 3 of these headstones. This is Willem Throne, and look what it says about him. He's a German prisoner of war, and he's held in Orangefield POW Hospital in Castlereagh. There's a number of them, but this is a burial order. Look here. See, all of the burial orders for the German personnel buried in the city cemetery, they've all got a small swastika. Somebody has put a small swastika. Now, they mightn't have been Nazis, but somebody has put a small, and here is you can see a record of service personnel, and among them you can see German Army, German Navy, German Army. These are Royal Navy Volunteer Reserves, Royal Irish Fusiliers. This is a small stone to commemorate 154 unidentified victims of the Blitz who died and are buried in the cemetery. Now, if you had a rosary bead or a miraculous medal, you could bury in Milltown. If not, you were buried in the city cemetery. It was just as simple as that. And these are unidentified dead in the city cemetery. These are 3 small plots to reinterred remains from Abington Street. There was a small burial ground on the Donegal Road which was attached to the poorhouse. In the 1980s they started to build houses on this ground, and they came across these remains in the foundation of the houses. And so they were lifted and then brought, and they only lifted the remains in the foundations. They then were brought to the city centre. This is an Armagh True Blues, LOL 154. The only reference that I can find to an Orange Lodge. It was raised in the Cavan Militia during the United Irish Rebellion, and after the militia regiments were stood down, the warrant lay dormant for a while until the 1880s, and then was given to a group of Armagh men living in North Belfast. And there is still an Armagh True Blues in North Belfast. This is Richard Rutledge Kane. Now, started life off as a primitive Methodist, but became a member of the Church of Ireland, and was rector of Christ Church, which is the corner of Durham Street and College Square North. And he led Lord Grant of Churchill onto the stage at the Ulster Hall in February of 1886 in opposition to Home Rule. He was the senior Orange man in the city. He dedicated the Orange Hall on the Shankill Road. But look what it says about him. A faithful pastor, gifted orator, and loyal Irish patriot. Now, I've had a few Irish patriots on my walk who have difficulty saying loyal in front of their name, and a few loyalists who can't get around the idea of being Irish patriots. But in this man, I think, represents the complexity of our society. And when you look at his life, at the Unionist Convention of 1892, there's a banner over one of the doors, Erin Go Bragh, Ireland Forever. And we think it's because of Rutledge Kane. And when the Gaelic League was formed in Belfast in 1895, August 1895, he is one of its sponsors. And he always talked about, you see his speeches, he saw himself as loyal Irish. And the way I interpret this stone is that there is no competition between his sense of being Irish and his sense of being a Unionist. And I always say this is what we need to get back to in a way, that he reminds us of the complexity of our identity, that identity doesn't run along parallel lines. There is not them and us. There are many, many complexions of identity, and I think he's a reminder of that. This is William Bridget, the father and mother of the young soldier I was talking about. Look what it says about his mother Annie. First worshipful mistress of Ireland's First Lady, LOL #1. How do we deal with these women? You know, when you look at the year 1912 and the signing of the Solemn League and Covenant, there was a declaration for women, and more women signed, including Annie Bridget, signed the declaration than men signed the covenant. And William Bridget was the banner, his company was the banner makers of the Orange Lodges, and they're still carrying William Bridget banners in orange marches to this day. This is Josiah Cunningham, a banker, very, very rich. And the Cunninghams were the bankers of the Ulster Unionist Council. And I said, very, very rich. They had two houses, Glencairn and Fernhill House, you know, at the top of the Shankill Road. The last Josiah Cunningham connected to the Unionist Party was a Josiah who died in an accident in 2000. This is Thomas Engler, a Unionist, but started life off as a Liberal, but in 1886 becomes a Liberal Unionist. And his family, Engler Siemens Church, Dunkern Presbyterian Church, he helped build that. And that church, that building today, we know it as the 174 Trust. He's a big ideologue of Ulster Unionism. And in 1912, he is given the task of writing the very first draft of the Solemn League and Covenant. And when he died in 1914, 1,000 UVF men marched in front of his hearse to the city cemetery. This is Fred Crawford. Every time I go to this grave, I always say to people I'm with, Joe Cahill, eat your heart out, because this is the mother of all gun runners. This man brought in 25,000 rifles and 2 million rounds of ammunition into Larne Harbour in April of 1914. He gets a bad historical press in that he suggested at one point that they kidnap Gladstone and bring him to a desert island. But in fact, I think he is highly crucial to the psychology of Ulster Unionism. Because if you think about it, when the UVF was formed, he had already brought across 10,000 weapons. So think of the psychological impact of having an army, you know, and creating that confidence, I think, inside unionism. This is George Ben, you know, the Ben Hospitals in Belfast. We know him for his book, The History of the Town of Belfast. He's buried there. This is Elizabeth Reid. It was her father, the Reverend Seton Reid, who wrote the very first history of the Presbyterian Church in Ireland. I don't know what's happening here. Give me a second. You never really know what you're going to find when you start to look at a headstone. This is the Reverend David Mitchell with one L. Is that how you say? The Mitchells were non-subscribing Presbyterians. Came to Ireland in the aftermath of the English Civil War and the upheaval in Scotland among the Presbyterians, and settled in Tory Island. Eventually, a Mitchell settled in Dungiven and was a minister in Dungiven. He had a son called John Mitchell. And John Mitchell, of course, we know today as a young Irelander. And John Mitchell was prolific in his opposition to English government in Ireland. So eventually they decided they would get rid of him, so they sent him to Australia. At the same time, there's another young Irelander sent to Australia called Thomas Francis Maher. Eventually both of them escape and go to the United States. This man's cousin, during the American Civil War, takes the side of the Confederacy, and his friend Thomas Francis Maher takes the side of the Union. At the Battle of Fredericksburg, this man's cousin is on the heights of Fredericksburg with the Confederate General Robert E. Lee and with a regiment of Irish, the 24th Georgia. And facing is his old friend Thomas Francis Maher, who's leading the Irish Brigades of the North. Mitchell loses 3 sons fighting for the Confederacy. One of them was the colonel in charge of Fort Sumter. Confederate colonel is where, of course, the American Civil War began, and another son died at Gettysburg in July of 1863. Eventually Mitchell comes back to Ireland, stands for an election, but the British government don't like the result, so disallow, have another election, and of course he gets elected again. But he's buried in Uri. So in this one stone, the upheaval in Britain in the aftermath of the English Civil War, the radicalization of republicanism inside Presbyterianism, the American Civil War, can all be got from this one stone. This is Margaret Byers, and Margaret married the Reverend John Byers, and the young couple then went as Presbyterian missionaries to Shanghai and China, and there she got two pieces of news. First, that she was pregnant, and on the day before her baby was born, she was told that her husband was dying. So after the birth of their baby, she arranged for the family to come back to Ireland. And this is the time of sailing ships, so she sailed across the Pacific up the coast of South America, but the husband died 5 days out from New York. It's buried there. She eventually came back to Ireland and stayed in Cookstown for a while, and then came to Belfast and started a school for young ladies. Margaret was passionate about the education of women, and we know her today, of course, as the founder of Victoria College. Look at the way she's described, the Reverend John Byers. There's a small plot in the city cemetery and a small cast iron shield that says the Ulster Female Penitentiary. And in that plot, there are 7 women, and described as ex-prostitutes. I always think that's a male term to criminalise women. And, but you wouldn't know that there's anyone in the plot. The women are meant to be anonymous. And I think when you look at the way the women in the penitentiary plot, they are anonymous. You're not meant to see them. You're not meant to ask questions about them. You're not meant to ask about the social conditions that drove these women, where these women ended up in penitentiary, because they are anonymous. And there isn't a great gap between the anonymous nature of the women in the penitentiary plot and the way Margaret Byers. So she's described as the widow of the Reverend John Byers. So her life is put in the context of a man who died 50 years before she did. This year, Victoria College again produced its quota of highly educated young women going out to university and into the world. That is Margaret Byers' legacy. You don't see it on the headstone. And I think this is classical of how women are written out of history. Now, this is Henry Cook Crawford, Presbyterian. There was 7 brothers. They were all early 40. One of the brothers was the cartoonist in charge of Punch, and they were all Republicans. And Henry Cook, along with a man called Bulwer Hobson, an IRB man, helped form the Ulster Literary Theatre. And again, that radicalisation you can see in the cemetery. This is a very famous East Belfast man, Thompson. His was the voice of many men. Of course, we know him today for his great play Over the Bridge. This is Engler's Bakery in Elijah Street. In due season you shall reap if you faint not. That's a beautiful stone. This is Faiz Muhammad. There are 2 Muslims buried in the cemetery. He was a student at Queen's and he died in 1929, even though it says on his plaque there that he died in 1924. This is James Stelfox. He was the manager of the Belfast Police Works, and the buildings on the Ormer Road were built by James. His grandson Dawson Stelfox, first Irishman to climb Mount Everest. This is a piece of Munster Irish found on a headstone. I was sick when you came to visit me, and again is a reminder of that connection with the Irish language. This is a stone of a Royal Naval captain who died in 1872. This cross is a half replica of St. Martin's Cross on the island of Iona. And this brought me on a pilgrimage to Iona because I was trying to do the research. St. Martin was he was Coptic, and
you look at the mother and child, and this ring is very typically Coptic. Look at the donkey with the cross in its tail. This is called a scriptural cross. Daniel in the lion's den. This is Abraham and Isaac. David playing the harp, and in the original it's got a piper, and then representations of David. So when the Christians came to Ireland, they start to appropriate, and not just in Ireland, they start to appropriate the religious beliefs that they find in the country, and this is one of them. We think of the snake and the devil, but in ancient mythology, the snake was a symbol of regeneration because it dropped its skin off, I think it's once a year. And this is snakes eating their own tails, which is, again, everlasting life and regeneration. This is a young boy, George Sayers, died when he was 14. This is on his headstone, 2 full rose flowers in bloom, a sickle, and a rosebud broken on its stem. These are the parents. The sickle is the grim reaper death, and this is George. He never got to bloom. This is the McCutcheon stone, Luke 21 months, 11 and a half months, 4 and a half, 7 months, 18 months. All children dying. This is a reminder of the vulnerability of children. I looked at the year that Louisa died, in a 5-week period in this city. It's 1895. In a 5-week period, over 370 children died in this city. That's 10 children a day died. And this reminds us of the vulnerability of children. And this is our grandparents, this is our parents, for some of us. Really the conditions only started to peter out by the 1950s, you know. I always say, my ma can look at you and say you've got German measles away to bed. She didn't need to go to A&E for half a day to find out. But she was over time, and women were able to spot German measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever. They did it and they knew. These conditions were only eradicated through better housing, better diet. I remember the old, milk at school, for the kids after. This is the section I was telling you about, owned by Queen's University. And we're right up to the future in terms of Pat Finucane, the solicitor, who's buried at the very top of the cemetery. Now, it wouldn't be me if I didn't end with a bit of humour. So this is a stone, Bring Me Up, Lord, which is obviously a Star Trek fan. And this is Gerald Duffy. Look what it says here. I told you I was sick. Now, Spike Milligan tried to use this, because Spike Milligan died after this, but the authorities in London wouldn't allow it. So what he did, the way he got around it was by putting his inscriptions in Irish. Now, I am of, this is the very last stone, you'll be glad to know. This is a cockle shell. So I am of the view that in the way we bury our dead is really, it is a fundamental process of our humanity. So many tens of thousands of years ago, my belief is someone buried their dead, and they moved at that point from, I suppose, an animal state where someone just dropped to a point where, first of all, they are starting, in burying your dead, you create history. If you're thinking someone from the past is a worse to you. And in doing that to earth, they put a stone down. And in time, the stone was coloured. So they create a sense of location, but also they start to create art. And then, as they start to create an emotional connection with their past. And it seems to me that in the process of burying our dead, we start to form our sense of humanity. And we know that because if you see a society that has no appreciation of its dead, it's a society that's dying. So I think remembering the dead and burying the dead and the rituals that we do to achieve that, it's all part of the development of us as human beings. But what I think, for hundreds of thousands of years, people, and they seek to have been putting a stone on a grave. We think of it in terms of 200 years or 300 years. But it is a common practice of human behaviour for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And when we see something like this, you know, we think of it, well, that's Victorian, but in fact, it goes back into the very, you know, the beginnings of our humanity and of you know, our practice as human beings and the values we put not just on our dead, but on ourselves. Thank you very much.